大家晚上好. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Yale Center Beijing. Can I get a show of hands for those of you who are here for the first time? Wow, that's pretty incredible. I'm just going to give a quick introduction and then welcome Professor Ardis Butterfield to the podium. My name is Carol Lee Rafferty. I am a member of the Yale College class of 2000, and I'm the executive director of Yale Center Beijing. For those of you who are new to the center, we were founded in 2014 as Yale University's only university-wide center outside of its U.S. campus, representing its 14 schools. Kind of like an embassy and an activity center. And throughout the year, we host events such as these with thought leaders from academia, business, government, culture, science and technology, various fields coming to speak on the most interesting or critical topics facing our world. So you're more than welcome to come to our events. Tonight, I am so honored and privileged to welcome Professor Ardis Butterfield from Yale University. This is her first time in China. And we're just so delighted to have her because on her travels, she has agreed to do this talk, which is on her new edited volume on medieval lyrics in Britain. She is a scholar of literature and music in 13th to 15th century Europe. Do people here know what these centuries align to in terms of Chinese dynasties? 13th and 15th century? Anyone? Our younger students, I see that we have young high school students, college students, graduate students, lifelong learners. Welcome everyone, and also Yale alums whom I learned wanted to study medieval literature, but actually ended up doing epidemiology, which is amazing. Professor Ardis Butterfield is the Marie Baroff Professor of English and by courtesy a Professor of French and Music. She was born in Pakistan and educated in South India and England and completed her bachelor's and PhD degree at Cambridge, at the Trinity College of Cambridge. Before joining Yale in 2012, she was a research fellow at Downing College and later professor at University College London. She has many works under her belt, including poetry and music in medieval France and The Familiar Enemy, Chaucer Language and the Nation in the 100 Years' War, 2009, which won the 2010 Society for French Studies R.H. Gapper Prize and was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Title in 2010 and was presented to the Académie Française. So without further ado, I am just so delighted that many of you are here to listen to this topic before the holiday season, and I hope you'll all enjoy this. Welcome, Professor Ardis Butterfield.
It's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And yes, I'm having a fabulous time. My first ever visit to China. So yeah, it's just been a ball. What I want to talk about today is my new edition. And I'm going to take you through a whole bunch of slides, actually, because what I'm doing is a kind of media study of medieval song. And this is what I'm going to try and explain through the manuscripts. So this is my first slide. What is a medieval English lyric? Now that sounds a strange question, perhaps, but it's when you're editing something, if you're editing the plays of Shakespeare, everybody knows what you're editing. You're editing a Shakespeare play. But in the case of medieval English lyrics, nobody agrees exactly what a medieval English lyric is. So what I've done, it's taken me about 20 years to do this project. In a sense, I've discovered, or I've asked the question all the way through, by looking at a lot of manuscripts from the 13th to the 15th centuries, and they have been very revealing of all kinds of ways of thinking about short verse. And one of the things that I'm doing is opening up the idea of an English lyric to include the other languages that were central to medieval Britain, but get forgotten about because everybody pays more attention to English than to anything else. So I'm paying attention also to French and to Latin, and I'm paying a lot of attention to music. So let me carry on. What is this? So I have it on good authority that Chaperone is one of the great singers of our time. And what is it? What do we think of with medieval English lyric? Well, in Britain or in the US, people think of horses riding off in great triumph with flags. They think of women with beautiful clothes, of knights and armor, and a lot of color, a lot of fun, as well as the jousting and the battle that goes with it. But this is a very contemporary. On the minute, she's just issued this song, and it shows how the medieval is very much part of contemporary pop culture in Britain. I don't know if you've come across Chaperone, but my younger son is a great fan, so I borrowed it from him. But really, that's one view of the Middle Ages now, Middle Ages in England, and then another view, which I think is the more standard view, is the idea of monks singing chant in churches, in cathedrals. And there you can see all the choir boys singing, and there you can see some medieval musical notation. And that's a beautiful, huge mass book now in Yale, Beinecke Library. And so these are the images that we have of song in the Middle Ages, one old, one new. But if you're trying to work out what to do with this notion of lyric in the Middle Ages, one question is, where do you start? And what I've done is picked one of the very earliest pieces of writing that survives as a song with English language. Now, the very first one, which some of you may know, is by a poet called Cadman. And he wrote back in his song was recorded by a historian called Bede back in the 8th century. And this was the first song to have English words. And here it is. It's written down in English in that right-hand column. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you to read it, but it's set into the story, the history that Bede was writing. But as you can see, there's no music. So the place where I'm starting is with the first poet whose songs were recorded with music, and the first poet in English. And here I want to show you the music. Now, one interesting thing about this manuscript, so this is a biography of a hermit called Godrich. Godrich lived for 100 years, astonishingly, in the 12th century, or early 11th to 12th century. And he was a pirate and a merchant. He spent all his life traveling the seas. And then towards the end, he decided, he became religious and decided to retire as a hermit in the north of England, and spent a lot of his life in freezing cold water, undergoing great penance for his sins. And then one evening he had a vision, and from the Virgin and of his sister, Virgin Mary, and songs were sung in this vision, and he began singing them himself. So he was revered as a saint by the local monastery, and a biography was written of him. And these songs were written down with music, but they were written down a bit late. The musical part was written down later. So there is you can see in the song, or in the narrative, that actually the writing has been scratched out, music has been added in, and then the writing has been replaced much closer. The lines are much closer to, because some of the space has been taken up by the music. So this is very interesting. And this is the song. It's a song about the Virgin Mary. This is the song. Very quiet. So that's. So I don't know if you could hear that. I think from a Western point of view, it's very beautiful. It's very solemn, very serious. It's about God, and there's a joke, not a joke really, a pun on Godrich's name. So he calls himself God Richer, but in the poem, it means God's kingdom. So he's talking about himself and also asking God to welcome him to his kingdom. Now, let me move on to the next slide, just to show you a little bit more in detail that one. And then here, there's another whole page which has all of the music for the songs in the biography. But the interesting thing here is that, that the songs are written in afterwards. So we don't know exactly whether they were what Godrich sang, but still, it's a kind of extraordinary survival. And that's why I started my edition with Godrich, the first poet in English with music. Now, in the first stages of copying down music and verse poetry with in English, you get lots of songs in strangely random places. So this one is one of my favorites. And it's on the back of a church document. So here's the document. It's about a command, if you like, an instruction from the Pope to a particular abbey. And so where is the music? Where is the song? It's on the back. Oh, someone has just suddenly written in a song on the back of this document. Now let me put it the right way up. And there you can see. And it's a song with 2 voice parts, but only 1 line of music has been written in. And this is what the poem says. And it's about a bird on a briar. And it's a love song. And the poet is talking about how dearly he loves, but also how he is in such anguish that he fears he is near death. Quite familiar words for a lot of love songs, but there we go. And so it's extraordinary to find this on the back of a Pope's order to an abbey on some very boring legal matter. Here's another one which is fun. And this is mysterious, invisible love writing. What do I mean by that? Well, look on this page. This is a page, again, of a treatise, something religious. Can you see a song on it? I'd be surprised if you could. Here's a close-up. Can you see anything? It's in the top margin. And without ink, someone has written in, if you can just see the faint marks, another love song. And again, this is a religious context, but this is a love song about how someone, is deeply missing his lady, or we presume it's his lady. Now, why has he written it like this? Well, my theory is that he didn't want anyone to read it. He wanted to write it, but he didn't want it to be read. So it was a kind of fun thing that he did in this otherwise very serious religious book. So these are fun, these are moments. This one doesn't have any music. This one does. Now this is written very expertly, more music here, clearly by a monk, because only the monks were trained, priests were trained to write music as well as this. But again, it's somewhat random. It's in the middle of a book of other things, and there it is. We don't quite know why. It's just a short little song with music. So those are some of the early examples. And then we get more complex songs, and this time they're written in more than one language, English and Latin, and English and French and Latin sometimes, or just French and Latin. Now, it just may surprise you that the most important language in Britain in the Middle Ages was not English. English was a minor vernacular language that people spoke, but didn't write that much in. And the much more important language to write in was Latin, and then the second most important language was French. But in this song, which is very famous, this is called Summer is a-Comin' In, and I'll just play you a little bit of it again, if I can. How can I play this? It's my IT person. Do I just press it?
Summer is a-Comin' In, so it's head and forward, it's strings the wood, sing, how I've led after London, after town, Ullen stärker bunga, världens fyra sing, Själv och sinnes är strikt bara Sommar is a-Comin' in, Trauma sing the blowet med the trim of wooden over. Sing och boden och sing och boden how again the after Sollen själv och boden är vi sitter på den sorgen sing Själv och sing vi själv och samlas på det slipp av
So look at this page. Can you see that there's a top line which is in black of verse and a second line in red? So the top line is in English and the second line is in Latin. But it's a good example of, if you look at the English words are all about summer is coming, spring is coming, the birds are singing, it's rebirth, the lambs are being born, the little calves are being born, and everything is good in the world. And there's a cuckoo singing. Now, the Latin words say something quite different. They are talking about the crucifixion and how God is looking out for his people and has given his only son to redeem them from their sins. It's very serious and solemn, whereas the English words are very jolly and full of fun. But it's very characteristic of English I guess, academics, students, to enjoy putting two quite different meanings of verse together. And so here we have the question of how do we actually perform it? In the black writing in the middle, just below the music, there are instructions on how to perform this, and it's a round. I don't know if you know this kind of music, where you start and then someone else joins in with the same, and then someone else joins in, and you can actually sing about 4 or even 6 people can sing the round together. So it's a kind of circular song, and then the last person is singing the last little beat, and then there's a bass as well. Da, 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 da. And so that keeps being repeated all the way through. So it's a funny song, nothing quite like it survives anywhere in England or in English or in Latin or in French or in any musical survival. It's very fun, and it must be something that the priests, the students in an abbey just produced for their own amusement, enjoying the fact that there's such a contrast between the two words. I'm just going to pass quickly over another couple, because this scene is the scene of the Annunciation. So a lot of songs in the Middle Ages were about Christianity, were about God, about Jesus, and about Jesus's mother, human mother, the Virgin Mary. And this is the moment where the angel was sent by God to tell Mary that she was going to give birth to God's son, and it's called the Annunciation. And it's a very solemn moment for the Christian religion, and Mary was the object of a lot of honor and worship in the Middle Ages. And so this song is another bilingual song that's in a manuscript, again, a whole bunch of songs. And again, you can see that there's Latin words and then there's English words underneath. And once more, it's bilingual. Now this, I can't resist telling you a funny story about this particular song. So again, it's quite serious, ostensibly. It's about the birth of Christ as a human baby. But Chaucer makes a very unsuitable joke about Angelus ad Virginem. And I don't know if any of you know Chaucer's tale, The Miller's Tale. Geoffrey Chaucer writes a whole bunch of stories about pilgrims traveling to Canterbury. And this is the miller who's drunk, disreputable, insists on telling a very obscene story in front of everybody. And because he's so drunk, they let him, because he's very strong and powerful, and they don't want to risk a fight developing. So the miller tells a story, and in the story, a student commits adultery with a carpenter's young, very attractive wife. The carpenter is an old man. And so one night, the student is on his own. Chaucer describes him as playing a guitar, and he's playing Angelus ad Virginem, this religious song, which is all about, so Christ was born to a carpenter, Joseph, and effectively Mary was a kind of adulterous relationship with God, which sounds terrible to us now, very, very blasphemous, but it's a very typical joke made by a medieval poet like Chaucer, who plays with the erotic meaning of a song and its religious meaning at one and the same time. So this is quite astonishing to us, I think, as contemporary readers, where we're very surprised to find that juxtaposition. So this is just something to discover about medieval song. And here's another kind of interesting juxtaposition. This is a book written by an academic full of learned information about physics, about law, and he has literally stuck in this little song with music, and I won't even tell you the words because, again, they're quite obscene. So it's an erotic little song stuck into an academic's book. That's quite a fun surprise as well. There's so many kinds of books in which one can see short verse and love poetry, but not just love poetry. But I also want to talk about the different languages in which they were written. And here are some books which are 13th century and some into the early 14th century. And they contain lots of verse that is in French and Latin as well as English. And this is a page, for example, where there are 3 languages on the one page, 3 songs in English and in French and in Latin. And this is very typical. And one of the interesting things that when editors have previously edited this manuscript, they've only picked out the words in English. They've ignored everything in Latin and French. And I'm trying to bring back the fact that there's Latin and French as well, because often there are many subtleties that are involved in realizing that the songs are in more than one language. And again, I think we could connect this to modern pop music, because a lot of modern pop music is translated, but also uses different languages, certainly in Western pop music. This is another extraordinary little example. This is just a scrap of parchment, very grubby, very dirty, very hard to read. It has 12 songs on it. So that is a surprise. Most are on this side, and then there are just a few on the back, which are just one-liners. And that's another example of how strangely songs survive and how you have to discover them as you go through. 15th century, that was a 14th century example. By the time you get to the 15th century, the number of manuscripts that are recording songs hugely increases. Why? Because English is becoming more established as a language in which you might want to not just create verse, poetry, but write it down. And on top of that, people are the middle classes. The more prosperous people became, the more they wanted to demonstrate how cultured and civilized they were. And so they started buying books, which previously only the priests would have recorded and used in great detail, really for teaching most of the time. Chaucer is an exception. There are a few poets in the 14th century whose poetry we have written down in English, and it's clearly widely read or known, but we only have records of it from the 15th century. So again, it's the 15th century where people start writing down interesting and often comic and sometimes obscene and sometimes just very serious. A lot of love writing is also very serious and religious. A lot of it gets written down. So I'll just give you a very few examples. I couldn't resist including this. This is an Oxford student's notebook. So he was a chorister in Oxford, and his notebook survives. It's quite messy, as you can see. He took a lot of notes on all his lectures in law, in languages, and again, science and all kinds of things. But he was a chorister, he sang, and there are about 8 songs which he just quickly sketches into his notebook. So they're very fun, and not many of them have music. He knew the melodies. He didn't need to write them down, but they're just some little scraps of melody here and there. So that's a fun book to come across. And there it is, an actual example of a student writing in the Middle Ages in England. Another way in which my edition seeks to be a multimedia edition, is that unlike a lot of 19th or 20th century verse, and certainly the way in which we think of lyric now, is that it's full of images. Certain types of verse come accompanied by images. And this next section is very serious, very religious. It's about the pain of the crucifixion. So just to recall, the Christ is born, And then at the age of 33, he is hauled up in front of the judges and he's sentenced to death. He's betrayed by his own people, and then he's sentenced to a very painful death where he is nailed to a cross. Now, there's a whole collection of images where people were required or wanted to, at the time of the crucifixion in the church's liturgical year, when it came to the moment where you remembered the crucifixion of Christ, people wanted to enter into the pain. And so there were these small books showing pictures of the so-called wounds of Christ. In other words, the weapons that were used to torture Christ. So this is quite hard and quite painful, I'm warning you, some of these images. And so here's a tiny book that was written, a tiny devotional book. And then here's another one, which is on a scroll. Now, I know in ancient Chinese literature, everything is written on rolls. We have some scrolls in medieval English writing and Latin and French as well. And this is a very small scroll. And if you open it up, you find all these images of these weapons of Christ interwoven or with verses. So the idea was that you would meditate on the image and the verse you would remember the verse, and it would help you articulate and identify with the pain that Christ was experiencing. So there are different images. There are the hammer that was used to hammer the nails into the cross, and the ladder to climb up to hang Jesus on the cross. So these are very vivid images that were used. And one of the things that I wanted to demonstrate was that if you didn't have the images, it wouldn't make any sense of the verse, right? You sort of need you need both. You need the image and the poetry, because otherwise you couldn't understand what the book was trying to do. Here's another one. Now, this is a very interesting book written by an order of monks who were not allowed to speak. They took an order of silence, and they lived separately in cells. And they copied all kinds of material in their long, long hours of every day. Now, this is, again, you can see an image of the crucified Christ. And it's a painful image. That he is bleeding, and his heart is bleeding. And then you can see the heart. It's very like a modern comic, even if one doesn't sound. And so there's a speech bubble coming out from Christ's mouth. And then the heart is enlarged and is in the middle. And those are the 5 wounds that were made on Christ's body, on his 2 hands, his 2 feet, and his central wound of emotional wound, if you like, of pain, and the spear wound in his side. Now, the person, the monk has written this verse, this poem, and then there's a figure in the middle who is praying to the Christ. And again, you can't really understand the poem if you don't have the image as well. So I'm printing the image alongside the poem. And the poem is a very quite common type of poem where Christ is shown to be speaking dramatically from the cross. And he's speaking with reproach to humankind. He's saying, "Oh, man, unkind, human. Mankind, unkind. I have in mind my pain, my sharp pain. Have in mind, have in your mind my sharp pains. Look at me and see that my pain, my heart is pierced for you." And then Christ says to the man praying, he says, "But don't feel sorry for me, because I'm doing this joyfully. the reason why I'm experiencing this pain is so that you can be redeemed and made joyful. But at the same time, I want you to understand how much my suffering extends in order to make you, in order to save you from death. So it's a complex poem, and it's complexly dramatic. The Christ figure is speaking to mankind and saying, pity me, but don't pity me. Pity me, but thank me for the kind of suffering that I'm going through. And the human response is sort of horror at the suffering, identifying with the suffering, and enormous joy that this suffering is being done for him. So again, a complex poem, but you need the image to really understand what's happening. And then I'll just show you very quickly, these are even more unusual poems. These are not verses, but just to give you an idea of the context for this kind of poem, this is actually called The Book of Blood. And it's the first few pages are just showing blood dripping. And this is one page to a black page, and then the next page, that is blood being represented. It's not physical blood, it's a representation of blood dripping down the page, streams of blood. So again, it's very painful. And then finally you get to, again, this picture of Christ bleeding on a cross, and around Christ are these arms of Christ again, the images of him being tortured, which you can perhaps see there as well. So it's a very powerful devotional experience, and this is part of what my edition is showing, that poems, verses, are not, if you like, independent of the medium in which they are represented. You need to understand the visual, the emotional, the sensual aspect of these verses. Can't talk about medieval literature without talking about sermons. Now, they're not the most popular form of reading now. Not many scholars now read medieval sermons, it has to be said. We prefer the poems, the shorter items, the comedy, the emotion. The sermons were wildly popular in the Middle Ages. So many survive, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And then it becomes surprising to discover that in some of the sermons, there are English citations. So again, you get English poems cited in these Latin sermons. Oh, I haven't even shown you one. Here's one. And just to show you that the preachers, there are good stories about the preachers to make their audience more involved. They would sometimes, it seems, break out into song in the middle of their sermons, trying to get their audience to wake up and get into the message. So there are these English citations. Some of them have a lot of citations, and some of them are in the form of, again, moralizing, teaching, you must behave better. But others are, again, love songs. And there are some interesting stories about preachers who get too caught up in the love songs and forget to preach their more stern moral messages. So I just picked this manuscript because it's got a fun little picture there. And it's another example of how these are human beings, right? They're people writing books who enjoy little sketches, little drawings in the margins. I just wanted to show you here as well. This is Carol. So one mysterious thing about medieval English verse is that almost none of it survives with music in the 14th century. So we have the 13th century ones that I showed you, and then we have very little for the 14th century, almost nothing for English words, and then they start being copied again in the 15th century. So it's just one of these puzzles. Nobody quite knows why. There are various reasons. One is that the music for English words was still not that taken not that seriously if it had English words. So French words and Latin words, the music for that would be kept, but you wouldn't necessarily think it worthwhile copying down music for English words. There's also the Reformation. So a little bit later, Henry VIII ransacked all the abbeys and cathedrals and monasteries, and a lot of stuff was burned or destroyed. And so it's that may be another reason why it just hasn't survived. But by the 15th century, more survives with music. And this is an example of a very sophisticated carol. Again, it's a scroll. A lot of music was copied onto scrolls. And here you can see this is music for 3 voices. You can, in fact, perform it with more than 3 voices, but here are some examples. And so this one is beautifully copied on this scroll. It's been a little bit damaged over the centuries, so again, it's quite hard to read. Now, the final category, which I've enjoyed finding and discovering, is another form of media, is that not everything, not all English verse survives on parchment. Some of it survives on other media, like glass, like stone, like rings, like jugs, and I'm about to show you some of them. Now, and wall painting. So here is one. This is to continue the rather grim theme. A lot of medieval poetry was did focus on death, but the idea was to remind you that you will die, and so you need to live differently now. But people had, especially in the 15th century as well, they had a quite gruesome, as it seems to us now, desire to have tombs made in advance of their deaths, where they would represent themselves as corpses on a tomb. And the idea was that it would be a reminder that you must enjoy life and live life well now, because you will no longer exist. Now, this is an example of a verse called Earth to Earth. And this is on a wall painting. And this is an interesting case because it's in a church and it's right next door to Shakespeare's school in Stratford. So Shakespeare went to a grammar school in Stratford, and this is the building next door. And on this wall is this Earth poem written out, as you can see. That figure on the left is Michael, the archangel. And then you can see this corpse with worms crawling around on it, and skeletons. And again, they're looking quite cheerful for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. But the idea is, again, that you take note. It's very vivid. So you take note and you make sure you live life well now. Other examples. Now, I wanted to play this to you. I know that, so there are a lot of bells in the Middle Ages. The music of bells was very public sound. In churches, people would hear bells many times during the day for all the different religious services. And I found this poem, very exciting, in a church up in the north of England. And I arrived and the bells were ringing, so I quickly recorded them. Not sure if I can do this. Let me see if I can find it. So those are medieval English bells, church bells, and they, I don't know if these bells themselves are medieval, but certainly there are many bells surviving in very old churches. And this is a very old church. You can see by the arches that it has, it's one of great age. And inside this church, there There we are. There is a stone font. Now, I don't know if you know what a font is, but a font is for baptism. So it's a stone, hollowed out piece of stone, often beautifully carved. And inside you would put holy water and you would baptize a child. So you would the priest would put the sign of the cross on the child with holy water and use oil as well, holy oil, to name the child. And the idea was that they would be then christened or baptized to protect them from evil. And also they did it very early when a lot of babies died when they were very young, just born, or even in childbirth. And so the idea was to baptize a child quickly to protect them from evil. Now, this is a beautiful carved stone, a font. Can you see the verse on it? Now, it's just a line, and I'll show you the close-up here. Now, what's fascinating about this stone is that it's been written in runic signs, but it's Middle English. So runic letters are much older. They come from the Norway, essentially, and Sweden and Iceland. They come from the Scandinavian countries, the Vikings who conquered the northern part of England, in fact, all of England, for a while. And these are old letters that have been written on the side of this font. Now, can you see underneath the figure? I think what he's doing, I think he's got a hammer or a chisel. I think he's chiseling into the stone. And then it says, Richard made me, and to this splendid place brought me. Who do you think is speaking? Sorry?
The stone itself.
The stone itself, absolutely. So it's a fascinating poem because, in a sense, the stone is giving credit to its creator, the craftsman who has done this beautiful carving. And because it's quite complex, because the creator of this stone is demonstrating, if you like, that he's made something living that can speak. And the whole point is that the stone is used for new birth, for new babies, to give them the life of a Christian upbringing, and to anoint them as being given the life of the Christian religion. So it's actually, again, an astonishingly complex piece of verse, but on an object and not on parchment. And again, with a voice emerging from the object itself. And here's another one. This is a castle, 14th century castle in England. And there's a verse on the wall. And can you see the plaque on the right-hand side? If you go up close, there it is. Quite hard to read. And I forgot to write out the poem for you, but it basically says, it's speaking, and it's saying to the visitor at the castle, he's saying, watch me, look at me. I am the defender of this region. Take care. This castle belongs to the lord of the region. Words to that effect. And again, it's the castle speaking. The castle is speaking to potential invaders, potential visitors, guests, but really to invaders, saying, take care, stand, stop, watch out. I am the guardian of this region. You have to get past me, this stone wall. So, and then some jugs. These are astonishing jugs. and they are bronze, very heavy, and they have verses written round the rim. Here's one. It's actually in the British Museum in London, and it's a beautiful object again. We don't quite know whether they were used for pouring because they're so heavy. I'm not sure how practical it would be, but they're regal objects in many respects. And one thing that's astonishing to know is that this group of jugs was found in the late 19th, early 20th century, not in England. It was found in Ghana, would you believe? And nobody quite knows how they ended up in Ghana, but they were in the exchange of war trophies in that sort of period. Somehow these medieval English objects ended up in a king's court or in a ruler's court in Ghana, Asante. And so they then were returned to England later. But it's an interesting example of how this object with verse written round it travelled so far in its history. A couple more examples. Rings. So rings have verses. I don't know if it's a Chinese custom to engrave rings. It still is quite often in the West to engrave a love motto inside a ring. So these are this ring is sapphire, and it has again a love verse, again quite a naughty erotic verse inside in French. And then this is my last example. This is in the 15th century again in England. In England, in the east side of the country, I don't know if you can picture England in your mind, don't worry if you can't, but there's a bulge on the right-hand side, and London is down at the bottom. And this eastern bulge is called East Anglia, and there's a city there called Norwich. And in that whole region, there are many surviving medieval churches, even medieval domestic buildings. And in the 15th century, people got very rich selling and producing wool. And the merchants there built these huge churches. And again, it was very important to them to encourage good works and to build big churches and spend a lot of money on chapels and on architecture and carvings and tombs, again, to earn themselves good favour with God. Now, this is a huge tower in a little village, which now has about 70 people in it, but it still survives. I don't know how they can afford to keep this huge church maintained. And inside this church, more bells. This is the belfry. So this is where, if you look at the top here, the bell tower goes right up there. So what we just saw here on the left, inside that tower, we're now inside, going right up. And on the ledge of the belfry, there's writing. Can you see that there's some writing on the ledge? And it says, God speed the plough and send us corn enough. And there's more verse that's part of it. And this is from a manuscript showing a ploughing scene with this poem, little poem, written above. So it's quite surprising, I think, for many people who study poetry in England. When we think of lyric poetry, we think of poems, again, usually not written in scrolls. Scrolls are just not part of contemporary literature. Everything is a book, of course online, but books are the material object and printed on paper, very uniform. Books and press printing is all about uniformity, exactly the same copy every time that prints out thousands of copies. And the paper is white, the ink is black, and a poem will be written on one side with white margins all around, and we read it silently. But what I'm trying to show about the Middle Ages is that these poems were written in many kinds of material, not just parchment, not just books, but also in scrolls, and then on these other objects as well, metal and on bronze. There are wooden jugs, the wooden bowls, there are all kinds of things, stained glass windows. And they also have music, some of them. And so they need to be understood as being very multiple in their character. And when we learn to read them, we need to learn to read them with a lot of sound and sensory experience that is part of the experience of reading. And so in a way, it's quite a shock for contemporary readers. We're not used to sound when we read. We may read silently in our heads. Some people, especially children, learn to read by sounding out. I don't know if that's also true in Chinese schools. In English schools, children are taught to read often by sounding out the letters. But it's a mark of being a child. The mark of being a sophisticated adult reader is that you read silently, which is why we have big libraries with hundreds of people working silently. So if you were in a medieval monastery, you wouldn't read silently. You would pronounce the words, but you'd also sing. You'd sing chant, you'd sing songs, and you might wear a piece of verse. You might scratch it on a wall, paint it somewhere. So this is a very active experience of understanding poetry as something that's part of life in an active and sonic and visual way. So my final slide is just what do I mean by songlines? Well, I mean, it's a kind of pun. I'm thinking about the lines of a musical stave. I'm thinking about the lines of writing verse. I'm thinking about the lines of transmission. So the connection between people. You may, if you hear something being recited, then many people in a room can hear at the same time. If you're reading privately, it's just you reading. So I'm interested again in the way that medieval poetry is sung in a public way or performed, not always sung, but recited or performed publicly with a lot of people listening who then may send it on its way, remember it and re-perform it in other contexts. And then the genealogical lines of history. So one of the interesting things you discover in medieval manuscripts is that you may have a verse that was first copied in the 12th century or 13th century, and then is copied many, many more times and ends up in the 15th century, slightly changed, probably, or quite often heavily changed, but transformed and reused and re-performed in that interval. So the verse, again, is not a single object that you read once privately on a page. It's something that is mobile, something that has a life, that moves throughout history between people and in the memory and in sound. Thank you very much.